don't know me, my name is Julia Ma. I am a junior and an officer of Asian American Culture Club.
My name is Kathy Zhao. I'm a junior and I'm also an officer of Asian American Culture Club.
For this block, we have some Newton North staff members who will share their experiences with us. Could each participant please introduce themselves, share how they identify in terms of race and or ethnicity, and what their role is at Newton North High School? Ms. Viola, if you would like to start.
Awesome, I can start. Hi, so everybody, good morning. My name is Jolene Filio. I use she, her pronouns. I identify as Filipino American and Asian American and broadly Asian, and I am a school counselor at North.
Hi everyone, I'm Star Lu. I use pronouns she, her, hers, and I'm Chinese American, also Asian American. I teach Chinese in the World Language Department.
Hi everyone. My name is Hi everyone, my name is Kanchan Kant and I'm in the math department. I teach math and computer programming. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I identify as Indian and Asian.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Casey Friend. I use the pronouns she, her, hers. I identify as Korean American, Asian American, and I work in the main office. You probably know my name from the absence list.
Hi everyone, my name is Michelle Leon. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a member of the English department and I also co-facilitate our Office of Human Rights as well as direct our Dover Legacy Scholars program.
Great, thank you. We are going to move on to the questions now. The first question we have is, what was it like for you to grow up as an Asian or Asian American?
Hello? That's a complicated question for me especially. So bit of context about who I am. I'm an immigrant. I moved to the US, to California, when I was 18. Actually, I turned 18 in California. So for most of my life, I was not in any way, shape, or form American. I identified as Filipino, I identified as Asian, but the American part didn't come until pretty recently, actually. Just a few years ago, I became an American citizen. So it's been a journey for me to try to reconcile and integrate, I think, that new part of my identity. It still feels like it doesn't quite fit. I've spent 30 years of my life not being American, and now, suddenly I am one, and that comes with certain responsibilities, it comes with certain expectations. When you travel abroad and your passport is American, it's a different treatment, right? Than when you travel abroad and your passport is Filipino, for example. So yeah, coming to the Americanness of my identity is still very much a process. I'm still trying to think of how my Americanness relates to all of the other different parts of my identity. So, check back with me in a few years. Maybe my answer will be a little bit different.
I'm similar in the way with Ms. Filio that I wasn't born or raised here. I was born and raised in China. My parents are still in Beijing. I came here when I was 26. So English is not my first language. So please forgive me if I mispronounce something. And I still can't differentiate the two words, Y-E-A-S-T and E-A-S-T. I can't tell the difference between these two, but I'm learning. So I became American citizen through naturalization in 2011, and now I'm very proudly to be embracing both Chinese and American culture, and I feel it's not an ending point where I feel totally be part of this or not part of which one. I think it's always a process, but I do feel so proud that I could have an experience to learn from both cultures in terms of what are good values and who I am, just gradually and progressively.
I think all of our experiences are pretty much similar. I came here when I was 22. I was born and I grew up in India. I finished my undergraduate studies over there. And so I grew up to be a proud Indian. That's all I knew. And that's like everybody looked like similar to me, talked the way I do. And our values were similar. We were taught the same things. And then I came over here and it was a revelation to be part of a global community wherein my Indianness or me being an Indian was just one part of who I am or who I could be. So it has been a process to figure out where that fits in me trying to be an American at some point, because I'm not yet. I'm not an American citizen yet. But still trying to figure out where my culture, where my traditions, where my values fit, while also opening up my mind to so much more that is out there and so many fallacies there are in the Indian culture too. It's a learning process, I think, and I'm still on it.
So I think I'm the only one up here that's different. I was actually born in South Korea. I'm a transracial adoptee. I came over when I was 4 months old. So I typically would put the American first, I guess, in Asian American, so American Asian. I grew up in Waltham, right next door. I have an older brother who's also adopted. We are not biological, so we have that in common together, that we were raised in a white family with French, Canadian, Polish parents. So growing up, I didn't have a lot of Asian friends. I could probably count on my hand of how many kids in my elementary school were Asian. So definitely a different process. And I think I'm still learning to embrace the Asian and put the Asian part first. So definitely a different experience for me.
So I really appreciate how all of our experiences have some commonalities and some differences, right? So I think I forgot to mention in my caffeine still kicking in mode that I identify as Asian American, specifically Chinese American, and my story is different in that I grew up in Hawaii, where it's predominantly Asian American. So some similarities, right, where you grew up with folks who, may look more similar to you than in this context at Newton North High School in Massachusetts, right? And because, growing up in Hawaii, where the majority of the population identifies as Asian American, even though we talked about this the other day, like with some folks, even though my experience in school was similar to here, where we read, a lot of canonical things, a lot of white, history and textbooks and literature, because my teachers were Asian American, because my classmates were Asian American, that was like who I was, right? Like I never felt like I had to choose between being Chinese or American. I could be in both worlds as one whole entity, right? So it actually wasn't until I came up to the continental United States for college, grad school, and work that I was like, oh, people treat you differently if they make assumptions about you based on how you look. So that was my experience.
Thank you all so much for sharing your experiences. I can say that as someone who has moved here from China, I also relate to a lot of what you guys talked about. So for our next question, I'd like you guys to talk about how you got to the point of being proud of being Asian American. I know that a lot of you guys touched on this, but was it more like a specific moment or was it more like a process?
For me, it was like always proud, right? And it wasn't until, I came up here and, the year I started at Newton North, there was a lot of us who identify as Asian American. Shout out to the class of 98. And, a lot of us in the auditorium and out there in the audience might know Ms. Vahey, who grew up, in New York. And we'd have these conversations and I'd be like, but that's not okay. Like, but there's a place where you can just be proud of being Asian American. So it wasn't anything I had to kind of like learn to grow into, right? In the same way, I think a lot of our students here who grew up in a predominantly white city like Newton or Boston, that's something that they kind of pick up. So I'd love to hear what y'all's experiences are.
So for me, it was more of a process, just because I wasn't immersed in my Korean culture growing up. I grew up eating American food, going to a predominantly white school, and not really knowing what else was out there in terms of any other Asian Americans. My brother had an adoptee in his class as well, so they were able to connect that way. But for me, I was just pretty much on my own. So that was definitely a process for me to go through a lot of hardships. It was hard for me to put the proud in American Asian, and I think I'm still learning to do that every day, especially now that I have two sons who are 5 and 4. So I want to make sure that I'm doing them justice and not making sure that they are going to be proud growing up. But I remember one time I went to Korean camp. My parents decided to send me to Korean camp for me to learn more, and I just sat there because I didn't know what to do. I didn't speak the language, so I was kind of just in this cloud of kids all by myself. And I think I went 2 days, and then I was like, I'm out. But so for me, it's been such a long process, and I think really when I hit that moment was in college. I went to school in Florida, so there weren't a lot of Asians down there at my school. I connected with some other ones there, and I realized, this is cool. So again, I still think I'm learning every day, and the help of some great colleagues as well. So.
For me, it still is a process. I think I grew up proud, because that's what I knew, and just like Michelle said, and that's how exactly it was. But when I came here, it became a process in trying to figure out where I fit and how to be re-proud, or figuring out how to be proud again of who I am, of what my culture is, and I think I'm still learning. So yeah.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Absolutely.
So you said relearning to be proud. I'd love to explore that a little bit, if you don't mind.
So relearning means so when I was in India, I still love Indian food, but I also used to love Indian attire, clothes and everything. Festivals, clothes, everything. And I still do, but now when I came here at the beginning, I had to think about whether I should do it or not, how I will be treated, what would other people think. I still do. I've gotten to a point where I do festivals my own way, but if I have to, even today, I had to think about, should I put on the traditional stuff and just, be proud of who I am, or would it offend someone? So just those kinds of things became a relearning process, and it's still an ongoing process, I would say.
I have to say I was not a confident person to grow up in China. And I was very quiet, and sometimes to the other extreme, I would misbehave in class since I didn't know what to do with myself at the time. So for me, the being proud part is more of that I became more and more proud of myself and being acceptance of who I am. I used to be just Chinese citizen, now I'm Asian American, Chinese American, then how to feel confident and proud of myself. And it is definitely a learning process. And I realize now that confidence doesn't come when you were born. Some people did have that, but I didn't have it. But I think it's through more and more through small steps that I set some things. It doesn't have to be high achievement. It could be that now today I'm sitting on the stage and talking. It could be small things like that. And I learned more and more to be proud of myself. And then therefore I'm naturally proud to be Chinese American, Asian American.
Yeah, for me, I resonate with a lot of what everyone has said about it being a process, right? Of coming here, figuring out what parts of your identity fit together, and integrating new parts of your identity. As a Filipino American, the Philippines was a U.S. colony at some point, so I was very used to the language, the culture. In some ways, it's a very westernized Asian country. We learn English while we are there. So some parts of being American naturally fit already, even if I was new to the country. However, there was one moment where it hit me that, oh my God, I'm American now, and that was my naturalization ceremony, where they give you the certificate of naturalization, you say the oath of allegiance to the flag, the oath to the U.S. that you're changing allegiance, and that was a really powerful moment. I didn't think going into that ceremony that I would be like tearful or very emotional. I came into it being like, okay, I'm gonna get my piece of paper, we're gonna say the Pledge of Allegiance, blah, 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 and then I'll leave. But it was a very impactful moment to me, and that was maybe really the first time that I was proud to be an American. But after that, I was like, okay, step back, still try to reintegrate what this Americanness means for me, for my identity and all that. So again, still a process, still ongoing, still very new. So yeah, but I am proud. It's just there are times where it ebbs and flows.
Coming to terms with all aspects of your identity is a constantly evolving and very unique process. So thank you all for sharing. Our next question is, what has your experience as an Asian American Pacific Islander been like, working at a predominantly white school?
I'll go. I feel very fortunate to be at Newton North Community. I used to teach in a different district, and when we talk about population percentage, our school has 42%, actually 15% of Asian American students, and faculty is 5%. When you think about it, oh, that's a small number. But in comparison, let's say, take Lexington, for example. Lexington High School has 42% of Asian American population, and teacher representation is only 1%. So in that way, I'm looking at our community and I'm looking at all the activities we do in the school. I feel very, very fortunate that I have such great colleagues, great guidance from the administration, and so many activities that our kids can feel part of.
I feel the same way. So I feel very fortunate to be teaching here. In the place I taught before, I was the only faculty who identified as a person of color, forget Asian American. So it's very different. It's a very happier situation, I would say. Like, we have affinity groups, we have culture days, we have clubs, we have places where people can explore the different cultures, the different communities, different ethnicities, whether it be staff or students. And I think that's amazing. So, yeah.
I second that. I think it's amazing that we have these days. Especially growing up, we never had this. And I'm actually motivated and inspired by students here who are so, I guess, ahead of the game almost, that they know who they are and know how to identify themselves. Because 20 years ago when I was in high school, it wasn't like that. So I think having these days and having the groups where people can express themselves is fantastic.
I agree. And I'm a firm believer in and, right? I think we and I feel very fortunate to be in a place like North, where there is so much support from administration, colleagues, and students. And Star, when you're like, and we have 5% versus 1%, I'm like, I went to a school where it was like, I don't know what percentage, English teacher here, dismantling model minority stereotypes, but it was more than 5%, right? So I guess it's all relative in a way, and I think I'm very appreciative of the fact that we are increasingly, as a community, both North and Newton generally, more aware of stories of Pacific Islanders, right? Particularly, unfortunately, the pandemic highlighting issues of racism and microaggressions that have existed historically. I think they've come up to light for those who weren't necessarily aware of it beforehand. And, for example, in our household, we were talking about how in New York City, you know, in 2 hours, right? Like people are you're nodding your heads, right? Like 7 women were assaulted by one man in that 2-hour time period, like following deaths of, you know, Asian American women who have been attacked across the country. And, you know, it's unfortunate that all those things happen. And I'm glad that we're talking about we're in. And I think in a lot of ways, Asian American Pacific Islanders have been in this liminal space, right? This in-between space where we're not white, right? I think we've all in our stories kind of hinted at we don't get the same treatment in a lot of ways or the same privileges that white folks do, right? And because of model minority stereotypes, perpetual foreigner stereotypes, white adjacency stereotypes, oftentimes I think our stories can get overlooked. So I'm glad that we are doing the work at North to check our biases so that we don't overlook the stories of our Asian American students and colleagues.
Okay, thank you. So as a newer-ish member of the faculty, I joined Newton North's faculty in 2019, right before COVID hit, hooray. I was really struck and surprised by how many Asian American faculty we already had. And in fact, my Newton North mentor, the person who runs Newton North and welcomes the new staff, is another fellow Filipino woman, Miss Belma Johnson, shout out. So I felt, you know, coming here was like, oh, there's already people who look like me and who share some of my experiences, and that made me feel comfortable. But I also recognize that I'm standing on the shoulder of giants, right? Like giants like Mrs. Leong and Ms. Vahey, and like they have kind of prepared the way for me to feel like, oh, I belong here, this is fine.
Thank you all for sharing your experiences. Now, as Ms. Leon brought up, following the pandemic, there has been an incredibly large spike in hate crimes against Asian American people. How has the pandemic affected your personal experience as an Asian American? For example, have you witnessed or experienced acts of anti-Asian racism?
For me, I have not personally experienced anti-racism. However, I've definitely witnessed it, and I have a lot of friends who live in California, San Francisco, New York, and honestly, I fear for their safety. I fear that they're going to be the next person who is going to be hurt, harmed, killed because of the way they look, because of how they identify. And it's really not a good feeling to have, to be constantly on edge, right? To worry for your friends and your family's safety. But personally, I'm going to tell you a story from the beginning of the pandemic. And this was around the time when COVID was starting. It was raging through the hospitals. My roommates at the time were nurses. And I was very, very sick with a respiratory illness that had all of the hallmarks of COVID. So took myself to a testing center. They said, you know, while you wait for the results of the test, go buy some Gatorade, go isolate, right? When I went to CVS to buy the stuff that I needed to isolate, I ran across an Asian man, a neighbor of mine. And I froze because I was like, oh my God, if I'm actually contagious, I don't want to be near anyone. I'm trying to avoid being close to anybody, right? But inadvertently, in my trying to avoid my neighbor, my man, this Asian man, he was like, "Oh, no, 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 it's okay, you can come close, I'm not infected." I'm like, "Okay." And so I was perpetuating, or he perceived that I was perpetuating like that fear of Asian people. And I was like, "Oh my God, no, I'm sorry, I am infected, I might be infected." And so I, went around. But that really hit me hard, that even as an Asian person, I could be perceived as like trying to avoid people of Asian descent.
I have one incident that when pandemic was hitting us hard, and we, in the beginning of, I don't remember whether it was our school was closed or not, but it was around March 2020. I went to grocery store to do my regular shopping, and then the customer, I was lining up at the cashier. The customer in front of me turned around and saw me, and immediately took out her arm and pushed my cart away, and then said with this posture saying, "Don't go close to me." So that was the first incident I personally received after the pandemic hit, as being hurtful and really sad. And another thing I want to share with people is that I hope my friends are not going to hate me. So during the pandemic, the hate crimes against Asians have increased tremendously. So in Newton, I live in Newton as well. So in Newton, there are WeChat groups. WeChat is similar to WhatsApp. So WeChat groups have all these ward unofficial representatives from the Chinese community. So each ward, the organizer has created a separate WeChat group. It's called Emergency Contact Group. And nobody can send any messages unless you have absolutely emergency, such as someone is coming to your house at night. And the strategy was, I could never imagine that coming to America or in any country at the time that I would have to do this. So the method was that we always leave our car key next to the bed. And if there's any robbery or burglary happening at night, first step is to press car alarm, so it goes off. Second step is to press 1 and send the message 1 to this WeChat group. And people would start driving here and have the cars on and call 911. So I never would have imagined that we had to do this in order to be safe. Of course, nothing happened, especially in Newton. However, the fact that such organization would do above and beyond just showed me how much Asian Americans were experiencing during that time.
Honestly, I'm sorry you had to go through that. I feel very fortunate that I did not have to think about that, and which in part has to do with a stereotype that we all have of what Asians look like, and I don't fit that. I am more brown than Asian, just by my skin color, and I don't fit that, and I didn't have to think about it. Even if I'm going into the grocery store, I was a person who would look out for other people because I was just cognizant of it, and I would just there were instances, at least I remember 2, where I had to speak to a cashier or a person who was saying something to somebody else. But personally, I didn't have to think about that. So I know it's due to a stereotype. I know that that's not the best thing in the world, but for the past 2 years, that has been my saving grace. So yeah, and I'm really, really sorry that we as a society put you through that.
I have not witnessed any hate crimes, but I did have an enormous fear. Like I said, I have 2 little boys, and I did not go to the grocery store with my 2 kids because I didn't know what would happen. I didn't want to put them in that situation. I didn't want them to see me react in a sense because, again, still kind of processing this whole Asian American identity. What do I say? I don't have family members who are Asian. I don't even have anyone really outside of this school network that I could talk to about my feelings and my experiences and my fears. So it was a really difficult time, and being like, thinking to myself, am I valid for feeling this way? That was a huge process for me.
Yeah, this is really hard to process and to try and, respond in a way where, like, I think we all want you in the audience to feel the depth of our emotions without letting it kind of like overtake, right? And I want to be clear, right? Like that I and everyone else here, like we're not playing like oppression Olympics, right? Like, racism, hatred, unfortunately happens to all different groups, and we are here just to speak about what we've experienced, right? And I hope you hear how real our pain is, right? And I think it sucks for us to have to question our validity of our experiences and our feelings, right? I have also been fortunate that I have not literally experienced physical assault, right? The fear is real, right? Like back to your story, Julian, like in the beginning and even now, like I try not to sneeze or cough among non-Asian folks. And if I have to sneeze, I'm like, allergies, it's just allergies. And I'm like, why do I need to apologize? And then it's like, so I don't get physically assaulted, right? And even then, I don't know if that's gonna work. I'm a mom to a teenager. So many of my students, right, at the start of the pandemic until now, as we're still in it, they talk about how fearful they are for themselves, for their parents, for their elderly grandparents. And these are people like in Newton, right? So like it happens everywhere, right? Even places where we don't think it might, right? I was at Trader Joe's like over the summer with my family, and a woman a woman who was unmasked, like started harassing me, and I kept like backing into like the produce section, and I had like nowhere else to go. And I tried to stand up for myself, do all the things like we try and teach our children and our students to do, to stand up for yourself. And like, thank goodness my husband, who happens to be white, was there, because he like physically got between the lady and me, right? And part of me is like, I just came here for groceries. Why are we doing this on the weekend? This is my time. And then there's another part of me is like, is she gonna like attack me in the middle of Trader Joe's and nobody's doing anything but my husband to stand up for me and my daughter? And it's like, it's not something you want to have to carry with you, right? Like you don't, and I think like talking about intersectionality as Asian American females, right? Like I think a lot of us pre-pandemic are very conscious about what we do to keep ourselves physically safe, right? When we walk down the street at night, all of these different things. And now you add the added layer, especially after Atlanta last year, right? And it sucks, right? When last summer there was a string of break-ins targeting Asian American homes in Newton, I also happen to live in Newton too, I was like, thank goodness all of our utilities are not under my name, because I kept my last name, Michelle Leong, right? It's under my husband's very white-sounding first and last name. So like if that's how the perpetrator was targeting houses, we were quote-unquote safe, right? But then I had to think, oh, we have all of these like signs in our windows, right? And I'm like, ooh, are they going to target us that way? And we had this conversation of like, do we give in to the fear and take out our signs, like proclaiming AAPI pride, AAPI solidarity, anti-racism solidarity? And we're like, we will not give in to that fear, and we like kept them up. But to have these conversations, it's a lot, right? And that said, I've felt very grateful for having, different staff and students of different racial backgrounds be supportive and be allies and co-conspirators over the last couple of years. So, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to build from there so that there'll be less of the fear and the weight that we carry with us.
It definitely has been especially hard because during this pandemic, along with the worry of our health and during that time where there were break-ins happening, API members also had to worry about the fact of reactions from other people and if they were going to be physically attacked as well. So, yeah. On a more sentimental note, our last question is, what advice would you give to your high school selves about being Asian American?
Before we start this, we forgot to plug. There should be a link in the live stream broadcast description. If you click on there or have your teacher click on there to put in some questions in a Google form, our officers will be able to access that to share those questions with us. So I don't know if I should start this one, given, yeah, you're like, yes. I would tell my high school self, growing up in a predominantly Asian American state, to continue to hold on to that pride and remember that when you come to the continental United States and you go to college and your instructor talks at you like you don't know English and she's really loud and slow because that's how she thinks you will understand her in front of the whole class, that, you know, that's going to happen, that when you go to places that there will be people who confuse you for other Asian American folks, even though you are short and not awesomely tall like other Asian American women. That even though you will experience racism and microaggression, like, it is important to hold on to that pride and to collaborate with others so that they too can feel that sense of pride and badassness in being Asian American.
Okay, high school self. I would say hold on to your pride. It's a very difficult thing to keep with you. And also learn about other cultures, learn about other ethnicities, learn about other people. Keep an open mind, but try to explore and understand who you are and where you stand, what your opinions are, what you stand for, and what you want to work on.
I don't know whether my answer would apply to the question because I was in China when I was in high school. I guess just to my high school self, I'm gonna say that don't be afraid of making small mistakes. And even though I disagree, I mean, you even though you may disagree with your parents, at least consider their suggestions. You could try and make mistakes, but at least consider it. That will save you from a lot of sad moments, crying alone on the couch, walking alone and running crazy on the street, crying. That actually will spare you some of those moments. Those moments will come. It's not bad. I mean, it was bad at the moment, but as long as you can stand out of those little mistakes, then you're gonna feel more self-worth and self-proudness and more accepting to other people as well.
Awesome. I love the theme of like telling yourself to be proud of who you are, because that's what I would tell my high school self. My high school self struggled very mightily with all the various parts of my identity. You know, I didn't grow up entirely in the Philippines. I was also living in Japan for a while, and so like coming back to the Philippines for high school was a struggle because I was not good at Filipino at the time, or speaking Tagalog rather. But what I would tell my high school self is don't try to minimize any part of what makes you who you are, whether that's being Filipino, whether that's being a third culture kid who's lived in different countries, whether that's being a Chinese Filipino, a Filipino with Chinese heritage, whether that's being queer, whether that's being a crazy cat lady. You know, never minimize any single part of who you are that makes yourself you, just to fit in, just to feel safe, just to be accepted. Because when you stop minimizing the people who will accept you for who you are will be your bride and dies for the rest of your life. And that's what happened with my high school friends who accepted me, every part of me, for who I am.
So I think just for me, learn to be you. I wasn't sure of who I was, so stand up for what you are and keep your mind open and learn. Do your research, explore. Like, I had great friends growing up too. Actually, shout out to Miss Castellano. We've known each other since preschool, so for those who know who she is. But because of her, I am here, literally at Newton North, and proud to be who I am. So, yeah.
So, kind of like shifting it a little bit, and again, plug for if any students or staff members have questions, feel free to put it in the Q&A link. It should be there. If it's not there, someone can text me or Ms. Bay and let us know that it's not accessible. That would be great. But like hearing what y'all said and shifting the question a little bit to like, what would we tell our high school students who identify as Asian American Pacific Islander? And I think like all of these things and whatever gender identity, I know we don't have, much diversity in terms of gender identity on this panel. I would encourage our AAPI students to, as you, do your research and explore, like, things can always get better, right? We shouldn't ever be complacent. And things are so much better in terms of the media, mainstream media, pop culture, like in terms of seeing different AAPI representations, right? You have South Asian, Southeast, East Asian, Pacific Islander. You have, talking about like intersectional identities, right? LGBTQIA identity. There's ability intersections, right? Like there's so many different things out there in, that you can see yourself as a Marvel superhero, right? Like, that's so cool. And you can see yourself now in more books, in YA books, in rom-coms. I think it's a lovely thing for folks to be able to see. So I don't know if you had anything to like share with our teenagers here.
I agree with everything you said, Ms. Leong. And the one thing I would say is not just for our AAPI students, but for our allies and other students too. Just do your research. AAPI community is not one monolith. Like, I can speak for myself. I am an Indian, which means there is no language called Indian. We have 30 official languages and hundreds of dialects. I can speak, understand, write at least 5 dialects of one language, and I can probably speak a few more words from 3 more languages, just in one country. Our food changes every 50 miles. Our clothes, our culture changes every 100 miles. Our climate changes. Like, that's just one country. Think about how many more countries we have which constitute AAPI community. So how many more cultures, diversity, ethnicities, everything that we bring, including identities. So not just like, yes, the people who belong to our community should research and should learn and should explore. But at the same time, people who are trying to be allies can also support us in this way when somebody comes to me and say, oh, this is an Indian festival, but it's not my festival because I'm just one part of the country. Or I'm learning Chinese when I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Mandarin has hundreds of dialects, right? Right? Mandarin is one of them. So there are so many more aspects of our community which gets hidden, which gets like washed away because we become one big monolith. So to our students, I would say just keep an open mind and research and learn and ask questions. We would be happy, like any person who belongs to a community would be happy to talk to you. Most of us, I think, would be more than happy to answer questions, but come in with an inquisitive, curious mind.
Well, a little addendum. I think maybe get to know somebody first, because I think like all of us here maybe but please don't just go up and be like, hey, tell me about I'm just joking. And Yeah, like for our allies, right? I love that shift. Like, I would love for our allies and co-conspirators to know that we are people of color too, right? We are. And we are here, speaking for us, are here to collaborate and to work together to dismantle, all of the oppressive structures that are keeping all of us down. So don't forget us when we're having conversations about race and supporting students, staff of color.
Okay, this is not a commercial time, okay? So don't take it as commercial time. My suggestion is to learn a world language. I feel that the reason why I'm able to come here and to learn so much more about America is because I studied English when I was little. However, even though I studied for 12 years before I came here, the first night I remember I got off the plane, my friend took me to a grocery store, and I wanted to buy a gallon of laundry detergent and some eggs just to get myself situated. At the checkout, the cashier said to me, "Okay, you're all set." I stood there thinking, what does it mean by it's all set? Do I need to set something up? What do I do now? So I just froze there until my friend came over and said, "Oh, let's go." So that moment was just a inspiring moment for me and awkward moment, thinking, I studied language for 12 years, and here I am in the country that speaks English, and I couldn't understand a sentence. So that just inspired me to learn more and thinking, oh, wow, this is actually, the 12 years do count, but it doesn't count now. So I have to go further than that. So along with the language is the culture. And so, for example, we celebrate Thanksgiving here every year, but instead of pumpkin pie, we have the Chinese red bean sticky rice pudding. And instead of stuffing, we have stir fry in the turkey. So for example, all these things have become a new culture and a new family tradition to celebrate. And I feel that all of you are going to live in a world that we have never lived in. So who knows what culture you may come up with and your family will celebrate. So learn a language.
Yeah, I love that. I love the whole making new traditions thing and blending different parts of our identity, blending your culture with that of your friends and other family members. That's what, going back to the earlier question of what makes you proud to be an American, or how did you become proud of being Asian American, is that blending really that makes me proud. So don't be afraid to blend, y'all.
I'll share a funny story. So my 5-year-old was at the beach up in Maine, so that was a little awkward to begin with. My husband is white, so my kids are half. And we were at the beach, and he saw this kid surfing who looked around the same age as him. So he was intrigued, sat there and watched, and as soon as the kid came out of the water, he ran up to him, followed him back to his beach blanket. I'm like, sorry, and walked up to him, and I said, oh, you're really good at surfing. He's like, yeah. I was like, how old are you? And he's like, 5. And we were like, oh, wow. And my son, whose name is Paxton, says, hi, are you Asian? Mind you, the boy who we followed was freckled-faced, reddish. No, I'm just not saying we don't, but a nice auburn red hair color. And I said, Paxton, we can say, hi, I'm Paxton. You don't have to lead with, hi, are you Asian? But that's just a moment where I'm proud to pass that on to him. So as students, I would say don't be afraid to ask questions of others too. Really get to know somebody. Learn those little things that like you might assume that I am mostly Asian. But really I incorporate so much American into my family that you might not know that. So I think just having the conversations, don't be afraid to have conversations with others. I think across the board as allies to everybody else as well, they are hard discussions sometimes, but just don't be afraid.
Thank you all for sharing your stories. And I would really like to comment on exploring other cultures, because I do think it's really, really important. It diversifies the way you view the world. And honestly, it's just really fun learning about other cultures and incorporating that into your own. But yeah, so that's the end of the questions that we have prepared. And now we have some questions from students. And just a reminder to continue filling out the form if you have any questions, and we'll ask them. Now, the first question that we have is, or the first comment is, thank you for sharing your stories. NNHS has an Asian American Culture Club. What's important to know about infinity spaces?
What's something that people should know about affinity spaces?
Yes.
I think people should know that affinity spaces are welcoming and inclusive spaces for folks to feel safe and supported, seen and heard. And I encourage folks to check out the different affinity spaces. We have so many, for so many intersectional parts of students' identities, and that is one of the many wonderful things about North.
Our next question from the Q&A is, to what extent do you still see or hear about anti-API racism in Newton?
I don't think there is more, I don't personally experience more racism. It's more of the negligence of supporting the AAPI community.
I think I have a slightly different take, where I think there is a continued presence of racism and microaggressions towards and against Asian Americans in Newton, like in the rest of the country. And I think something to remember is that when we talk about assaults or incidents of harassment, we're talking about reported numbers, right? So the number of incidents that are actually happening are probably much higher. I know, I hear from students about times when they don't necessarily feel emotionally safe, right? So I think it is still happening, unfortunately. And so the call to action for our allies out in the audience is to, encourage you to continue to find ways to partner and stand up for and with Asian Americans. So acts of negligence or racism or microaggressions can decrease or cease to exist.
Thank you for sharing. To also build off of what you said about that, I am aware, with my Asian American friends, that there have been a lot of anti-API racism, and they have not been able to report it, or they have reported it, and there's nothing that the police could have done about it. So even though it might not be at the forefront, it's definitely still happening, and it's an important topic that we need to talk about. The next question that students have is, what do you think North and the Newton community can do better to support students in Asian American culture and minimize hate?
So I'm going to call in a genius bit of framing and advertisement from the TSA of all people, which is the line, if you see something, say something, right? Such a powerful line. Oh, the TSA, I hate them for creating it. But that's what we would love for you and, as Asian Americans, allies, co-conspirators to do. If you see something, if you're experiencing something that is hurtful, harmful, say something. Go to a teacher who you trust. Go to a school counselor who you trust, a coach. And, we, as the adults in the building, can support you on that. So we really take everything seriously. If you report it to one of us as counselors, we will do something about it.
I would also add, be willing to learn. I think that is our biggest weapon against hate and racism. Be open-minded and willing to learn. And probably we can diminish or get the numbers down to zero.
I know my suggestion is probably against everybody's will. I would say on social media, if you can't say something in front of someone's face, don't post it on social media. So try to eliminate hateful speech or getting involved in hateful speech, and be willing to stand up for AAPI community friends by calling out that is not nice. Believe me, adults also do this. So I'm hoping that with our students growing up, you're going to be better than us.
And adding on to that, I think the more we can challenge ourselves, whatever our racial backgrounds are, to recognize that we are more than just stereotypes, right? I think once we can encourage ourselves to learn that and really know that, then we can ask ourselves these questions before we say or do something, right? Am I wanting to say or do this because of this belief that, is rooted in this stereotype? So I'm checking that, so I'm going to circle back and maybe not say or do or post that, right? I think the more we can do that, the more all of us, whatever our racial backgrounds are, the more we do that, we can really stand in solidarity against these acts of hatred.
Many of you spoke about the importance of learning about other cultures. Are there specific books, shows, movies, etc. that you would recommend?
Well, not to sound like an ad, but there are a number of great classes that explore and have a number of different texts that celebrate the multiplicities of Asian American Pacific Islander experiences. You can check them out in opportunities online. There's a great book, in all seriousness, that came out yesterday, or what day is today? March 1st it came out. It's called Rise. It's an anthology by, I'm going to need some help from the audience, Jeff Yang, Philip Yu, and I think Philip Wong. And it's just an everything you could ever want to know in terms of the histories, the pop culture, everything juicy about Asian American Pacific Islander-ness. And I just started reading it. It's amazing. I love it. It has references to important court cases, historical events, acts of resistance and activism, because I think a lot of times people forget that Asian Americans are also protesters and resistors, right? And it talks about the history of Asian Americans in television, right, from Margaret Cho in the 1990s to 20 years later. There was nothing till Fresh Off the Boat, and all of this cool stuff. So I highly recommend it. It's called Rise by Jeff Yang, Phil Yu, and Philip Wong.
If you want a funny book to read to learn more about Chinese culture in particular, I highly recommend Rivertown by Peter Hessler. It is a very funny book, easy to read, full of humor, that will get people will get familiar with one particular town in Sichuan province. If we have been to a Chinese restaurant, 80% of them are called Sichuan something. So, so that's a fun book to read.
Yeah. For TV, Fresh Off the Boat, amazing. Also, Kim's Convenience, love them. I've met Appa in real life. Thank you very much. Yes, I have. But for books, two things. One is the book Not Quite Not White by Sharmila Sen. She is an Indian American immigrant, but I also, see, there you go, hearts. We're just like gushing over our Asian American icons, and Canadian American also. But anyway, the first book is Not Quite Not White, and the second book is for people like me, not just Asian American, but for students of different cultures who grew up moving a lot when they were younger to different countries, different states. And that book is called Third Culture Kids Growing Up Among Worlds. I found that as a very affirming book as someone who holds multiple identities and multiple cultures in one little package.
I think this is me being a math teacher is going to fail me. So I don't have any big recommendations other than what Ms. Folio said, but I would also encourage you, not just books and media, but you can also find social media people you can follow who can give you a better sense of Asian American culture. So I don't have names at the top of my head which students would know. But but that is something you can look into too, and that's another way you can explore the cultures.
So, like Captain America, I could do this all day in terms of giving book recommendations. You made me think of, right, in terms of multiplicity of experiences, we talked about the book All You Can Ever Know by Nicole Chung, right? For our students in the audience who are transracial adoptees, it's a lovely, powerful memoir. Crying in H Mart is amazing as well in terms of, biracial Asian American experiences. And I think too, it's important for us to, if you're hungry for more books, more movies, is to recognize that all of our different recommendations represent different ways in which one can connect with their Asian American identities, right? So not to confuse them, right? So, the book Star recommended, right? It's not necessarily something that speaks to like the same Asian American experience that Never Know might, or Sharmila Sen's book, right? So recognizing that there are differences and appreciating all of these differences, right? Like you can watch a movie like Parasite to understand, or to get a glimpse into like a Korean cinematic experience and understand that it's not the same as Minari, which is a lovely, Korean American experience. And even that, is going to be different from Kim's Convenience, right? Because of the different locations in terms of geography within North America. So definitely dig deep. There's so much out there. And remember that, one book or one movie is not going to be the representative for like all of our experiences.
So thank you for sharing your recommendations. Fun fact, my sister actually, there's a character on Fresh Off the Boat, which is a show I highly recommend. And my sister knows him and has a class with him. But yes, Hudson Yang. Yes.
Building Hudson Yang's dad, Jeff Yang, who wrote Rise, he and some other folks collaborated on a graphic novel called Secret Identities. And we actually had him here for Asian Culture Day, like way back when in the old building. So it's cool how things are circling back.
That's so cool. Unfortunately, this marks the end of our A Block panel. So thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you all for Asian Culture Night, which will be on March 26th. Sign-ups to perform are still open, so you can sign up until March 6th, midnight. If you're interested in joining Asian American Culture Club, we meet Tuesdays during Tiger Block in room 353. If you have any questions, email the officers through social media or through email if you're interested in joining and learning more about Asian American culture and identity. Thank you all.